let me actually start recording this before I say this. We're very lucky to be joined today by Dr. Andrew Vickers, who's a biostatistician and attending research methodologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Andrew received his bachelor's degree from the University of Cambridge and a doctoral degree from the University of Oxford. He's conducted extensive methodological and empirical research into clinical trials, patient-reported outcomes, prediction modeling, and really pioneered things in the area of like decision analysis, and generally has, I think, written a lot of very influential papers across different domains of methodology. And one of the things I'm most excited about is that while doing all of this, Dr. Vickers has been able to be an excellent communicator. His writing is really clear and entertaining. In fact, I would highly recommend his book, What is a P-Value Anyway? And so we're really lucky to have Dr. Vickers joining us for this ReproRehab webinar today. We'll be talking about how to teach biostatistics to clinical investigators, reflections on a 20-year experience. And to make this a little more interactive, as Andrew and I were planning, we were talking about having kind of a Q&A where maybe people could ask him questions, and then we get the benefit of his wisdom coming back to us. But we're actually going to flip that around a little bit, I think, and actually Andrew will ask us questions to kind of get our answers and our perspective, and then he can kind of reflect that back at us about his experience and things that he picks up on. So I think it's really going to be an awesome open-ended discussion. But the other thing I'll say there is that it will be most valuable, right, with active participation. So I would encourage you to throw things out there, even if you're relatively new to teaching this stuff. If you have limited experience, just talk to us, from your perspective. And I think that's going to be really helpful in steering this conversation and making sure everyone gets the most out of it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, if you say something that's a little bit stupid or a dumb question, we're going to be writing your name down, tweeting about it, laughing about you behind the water coolers. So, no, I mean, look, obviously not, right? This is a very safe space. And I was just saying to Keith, science is a very sophisticated word for learning from our mistakes. Everything we do in science is because we used to do it another way. I don't know if anyone ever heard this. Like, why do we tape record? Why do sociologists tape record their interviews? It's because they remember that they realize that memory can be selective. Why do we randomize in randomized trials? Because of selection. We learned that people there was selection bias. So we learn from our mistakes. That's what science is. So let's learn from our mistakes in everything that we do in learning, whether it's learning statistics or in learning how to teach statistics. One other thing I want to say is that, a story I often tell is that, I give talks all around the world on, various, my research in decision modeling, in PSA screening. I was just discussing, I'm going to Milan to talk about national policies and PSA, and all this very academic, high-level stuff. The number one most popular talk that I give is called How to Have a Successful Academic Career. And it's very common that I'll give my grand rounds to the faculty, and it's all very formal. I'll give a lecture with a PowerPoint, and I say, okay, that's 7 to 8, the surgeons, right? So it's 7 a.m. 8 a.m. I want to meet the junior faculty and the fellows in a small conference room, and we go, and we just I'm there with a whiteboard, and we just discuss how to be successful, and that's always the most successful talk, the most popular talk I give. And to summarize that talk is, what I encourage you to do is write down everything that you think you're going to need to be successful in your career, and you'll find you can put it in one of two columns: the stuff you're taught and the stuff you're not taught. And the stuff you're taught, like, is statistics or science, or as a doctor you're taught clinical judgment. And then there's other things like dealing with email, hiring and firing, managing people, how to teach, how to present, how to write. There's a whole list of things that you're not taught. And what most academics do is kind of muddle through. It's why are most presentations, I don't know what your experience is, but most presentations at most conferences I go to are absolutely dreadful. And that's just because the go, to do a presentation, I'll put some slides together. And I sometimes work with fellows that've just given a presentation. And I say, what principles were you following? And they're like, I'm like, you weren't. And that's why it was a terrible talk, right? And they're like, sorry, doctor, I lost your email. Well, what principles are you following in dealing with your email? And I'm like, what do you mean, what principles? And I'm like, well, how are you organizing your email? Well, I kind of, you're not following any principles. And I say to these people, you can open up a human body and remove an organ the size of a walnut from deep inside the pelvic cavity, and the patient goes home the next day, and yet you can't work out how to do your email. It's not really hard, actually. You can just look up 5 tips for dealing with your email, or what are the 3 principles of having 0 inbox or whatever, and you've learned how to. So there's a whole bunch of things that all those things down on the kind of right-hand column, all those things that you're not taught, you're probably taught because they're not that hard, actually, right? But you do have to think about them, and you do have to follow some principles in the way that you're doing them. And of course, what we're talking about today is teaching. And most people, if you just kind of think like, oh crap, I've got to do some teaching. Okay, I better put together a lecture course and some slides, and I'll work something out, and then just go and start teaching, and which is what I did, 20, 25 years ago. Then you're doing what academics do, which is not following any particular principles, right? You're just kind of muddling through and doing what you do. So what we're going to be talking about now is principles of good teaching in biostatistics as a subset of all the things you have to do as an academic to be successful that you're not taught. Well, just you got to sit down, write down some principles, think about it, apply those principles, and you'll be amazingly successful. One of the before we go to the stats, a last anecdote that I say to illustrate this is that I was once invited, all the top people at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is my hospital, is the top cancer pathologists, top cancer surgeons, were invited, all of us, to go to this one hospital to give a talk. And then after the talk, we all got back in this minivan to go to the airport. And of course, what does everyone do? They get out their laptops and they start answering email. And the guy sitting next to me, absolutely brilliant man, pathologist, incredible. He's sitting there doing, this is what he's like. He's like answering his emails. By the time I got to the airport, I'd written like 10, 15 emails. He'd written 2. And I was much more productive than him, not because I'm harder working or because I'm smarter or more brilliant, just because I've learned to type, right? And I think like, oh, wait a minute, that's something I need to do because I'm writing all the time. I'm going to learn to type, and I'm going to learn to type fast. And so I actually am objectively much more productive than this other guy. And I think a lot of it is because I learned to, as I said, not because I'm smart, not because I'm brilliant, just because I learned to type. So identify these things that you need to do, and you will end up being much more successful with your peers just because you've worked out what the principles are. What I want to make you is they're like, oh, that's a great teacher. That teacher's so much better than all the other teachers, and I'm really learning from their class, and it's because you're going to follow some principles. So one of the principles we're going to talk about is interactivity. One of the principles of learning is you don't learn if you're being lectured at. You can't cram knowledge into somebody's head, right? They have to reach out and grab the knowledge and pull it in, essentially. So that's one of the reasons why I want to make this sort of interactive. I should mention, I don't lecture, basically. I kind of give one lecture at the very end of the course. I give one lecture at the beginning that is sort of a housekeeping-y one, which is like, here's how we're going to do the course. And then one lecture at the very end, which is just on the stakes, just to make sure everybody has got that, a few really critical things done. But the rest of the way that I teach is not with lectures at all. And people say, why don't you want to lecture? I'm like, go to YouTube. You want a stats lecture? There's a bazillion of them on YouTube, right? That's not what you need me for. I'm a very experienced person who knows a lot about this. What you get is me in the room to talk to you, and that's what I do. So let's start that. There's a question to you guys. As far as I understand, go on.
Yeah, so I have a question on that. So
yeah.
If the format of your department for like didactics for teaching that is very lecture driven, And to your point of getting people to interact, have you used the techniques of just calling people out? Because there's pros and cons to that. But if you sit there in a room full of, 10 residents and you ask a question and everyone's too shy to say something, it just gets really uncomfortably quiet for like 5 to 10 minutes, no matter how much you egg them on, right? So how do you nicely force them to interact?
It's something that I've struggled with, and it's particularly, I don't teach residents, I actually treat fellows, and fellows are just at this very last point where they're about to become an academic and they really don't stupid. So they really are one of the worst groups. I think one of the things is not to be afraid of silence is something. I think it is okay to actually call people out. I think the other thing that I've started doing recently is say, everyone's going to bring a textbook, bring a little notebook or your laptop, and I'm going to ask a question, and you're going to write down your own answer. You don't necessarily have to shout it out, but write down your own answer. And if somebody doesn't respond, I might call you because you've all written down your answer. Right? It's not actually necessary that someone calls out what their answer is. What's necessary is that they're at least thinking, that you've made them, they're not just a passive recipients, right? How do you think we should do this? And then they're starting to think about it, is the really key part. Whether they yell, oh, hey, Dr. Jones, my idea is this, they've gone through that process. That's why I like write it, okay, so, all right, what do we think this should be? Everyone just take a moment, write down your thoughts here, or type out your thoughts. I think that's one technique that you can do. But let me, but just to answer your question in terms of lectures, I mean, what a lecture is, has two meanings. It means it's a period of time where you're in the room with the students, and it means you're standing at a lectern and yelling at people, right? And the first is a kind of administrative category, and that's fine. And the second one is a pedagogical strategy, and I think it's highly problematic because it's been shown not to work, right? We should be doing evidence-based medicine, evidence-based sports medicine, evidence-based teaching, right? What is the way to teach supported by the evidence that leads to the greatest learning? So one of the first things you have to think about, and I want you to answer me now, or maybe that we should use the technique I just said. Everyone spend 1 minute writing down an answer to this question. What do you want your students to know after they complete their course? Right, you're teaching.
Can you repeat that last part?
Okay, so you're teaching a course, as I understand it, you guys are teaching a course in statistics to clinicians, right? That's roughly what you guys are doing? Yeah. So what do you want the clinicians to know the day after they've completed your course? I won't do that. I'm just going to get some more note paper. Yeah, or two. Maybe, I don't know. I would. Some people might just want to write out. I write down 3 words, but some people might want to write down 3 bullet points. Several bullet points. It's really up to you. Okay. Does anyone still need a bit of time, or we're okay? Okay. Does anyone want to, I think we should hear from at least half of you about what you think students should learn. And please, by the way, if the first person says, we want to learn X, and you're like, oh yeah, that's true. Don't just repeat that, right? Please just honestly write down. No one's judging you, right? It's not like, oh, you got the right answer, well done. Hey Keith, that student number 6 is you should give them a gold star, right? We're here to learn, right? So just say what you originally wrote down. So Does anyone want to volunteer to go first?
I can give a try.
Okay, go on.
Hey, hi, my name is Akhil. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in Cleveland Clinic, so I don't know the audience actually. There might be some seniors, and I'm just beginning my lifestyle. So suppose I'm going to teach a course. There are three things I wrote it down. One is, the people who are attending at least will be read and able to understand the statistics from a research paper. At least they are equipped to do that. Actually, they can read and understand when it is being wrote. Actually, and then second part is they are able to convey what they understood to their peer groups. Actually, this is what I read. This is what they were able to discuss it effectively with their peer groups. Last thing is that use it in some ways in their clinical practice. Those are the three things I wrote. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting. I see that as two things, right? Because you can't, there's pedagogical, you can look this up, there's the stages of understanding something. If you can't communicate it, you didn't fully understand it, right? So if you, right, so kind of communication is the key thing. So yeah, you want someone to like read a paper and understand it. I think that's great. I think what's missing is what is it you need to understand, right? So that's what we want to think of more, right? Because there's all sorts of things that could be written there. Now, I would just, for example, and I just want to put it out there, I don't want you or anyone else to answer this, but I might write a paper with some incredibly complex. I mean, we were just talking about a general additive model in a time to event data, with, very, very complicated. Do we actually need the clinician to understand what a general additive time to event proportional hazards model is? Because I would say no, we don't need them to understand that, to understand the paper. So I think you're absolutely right. We want them to understand the stats in papers, but there's various different things that they can and that they need to understand, maybe bits that they don't understand. So we might have to be a little bit more specific about what it is they need to understand and what it isn't that they might not need to understand. But it's an interesting
so
answer.
that kind of debunks my two.
Okay. Right. That's
so we might as well
absolutely
just get this over with.
Yeah. No, look. This is the whole point, right? You have to be getting shit wrong, because if you got it right, then there's no point in you sitting here, right?
Yeah, so I tend to teach mine in a way that the first question was, I only have two, I don't have three.
That's fine.
And mine,
I wrote down 3 words, right?
Okay. Mine are phrases. But the first one is just, I always want them to understand, like, what did I just do? Do I understand what I just did? And then, is it meaningful? And that's a weighted second question. So we go into at least
when I'm doing my stats, in other words, yeah. If I'm analysis, okay.
And then, is the thing that I did meaningful? Does it, and that's multi-layered. I realize that. And we talk about that a lot actually in the course I've been running now, because there's statistically meaningful and then there's clinically meaningful, and they're not always one and the same. And that distinction is an interconnected discussion. It's not, it's not an algorithm that you can always put down and always follow. So.
Okay. So just a couple of questions on that, which is, one I think is a really great point, because, one of the things in my book that I do is I cite actually a conversation I overheard between a statistician and they're talking, and the statistician says, well, oh, wait a minute, you've done the analysis. I thought I was going to do the analysis. You've already worked out the p-value. And he said, yes, I used a multinomial regression model. And he said, and the statistician says, how'd you come up with that? And he said, well, I chose every option in SPSS, and that was the one that gave me the smallest p-value. Right? So, you want people to understand what they did, not just like the statisticians, not operators of statistical software, right? You want someone to be a violin player, not a violin operator, right? Same kind of general principle. So yeah, so that's good. Just one question: when you say clinically versus statistically meaningful, are you talking about statistical versus clinically relevant? So p could be less than 5%, but it's a very small effect, or do you mean it in some other way?
Yes, that way. The first way.
Yeah. So I would actually put that under interpreting results, right? And the way that I explain this in my courses is that everyone what I do is I show a slide, and it's got an equation in the middle, and it says math. And I say, if you talk to anyone, what do we do as statisticians? They say math, right? My partner's daughter is always like, Andrew, how could you always do math all day? It's so boring. I'm like, I don't do any math. The computer does, right? It's true, right? We're sitting and have these very sophisticated conversations about generalized additive models in time to event data. I'm not doing any math. I'm like, okay, we're going to do that. Then we do a bit of programming and the computer does it, right? What is biostatistics? Biostatistics is turning biology or biomedicine into math and then converting the math back into biomedicine. That's what we do as biostatisticians. If we were econometricians, we would be turning human economic behavior into math and then back into human economic behavior. And same for, we could say the same thing about psychologists or psychometricians or whatever, but we're biometricians. And the hard thing is, you've got a question and I'm going to turn that into some kind of analysis or some hypothesis, right? It's like, okay, so you're worried, you think the new drug is kind of the new drug's better than the old drug, and it's like, oh no, it's not better, but it's, it's safer. All right, so what you're saying is you just don't want this new drug to be worse than the current. All right, that's non-inferiority. That's a one-sided, right? So I'm turning the biology into math. Or, another example, I think, Keith, you were just talking about how much question is how much do you have to know the biology in order to be a statistician? I think, we just hired a new statistician, new master statistician. First day, training is like, great, what am I doing? Survival analysis? I'm like, no, read this book. It's this thick. It's called The Prostate Book. And there'll be a test afterwards. Right? Most statisticians are not going to make mistakes on a logistic regression. What they're going to make a mistake on is whether a variable is a continuous one or a categorical one, because they don't understand the biology of the medicine, right? So in my field of prostate cancer, there's something called the Gleason score. The Gleason score is from 2 to 10. It looks like a continuous variable, but it's not. Turns out that 2 to the 6, 2 and 6 are the same number. 7 is either 3 plus 4 and 4 plus 3. And then you have 8, and then 9 and 10 are also the same number. And it's actually a category. You just have to understand how pathologists grade to know that that's actually ordinal, not continuous. And I was once in a huge dispute with a statistician. We realized all it was is that he didn't realize that this wasn't a continuous variable. We'd come to different results from the same analysis. So you really do have to understand that biology. So in that first part, converting biology into math is only possible. Biomedicine into math is only possible if you as a statistician understand the biomedicine. And I have to say, my team here is amazing. And, I was just hearing about a case where there was a question about whether repeated biopsy had an effect of the prostate on erectile function, because all the nerves to the penis go, right around the prostate. And the statistician asked, is this an injury or is it inflammation? Because if it's an injury, we're going to look at long-term outcome. And if it's inflammation, we're going to look at short-term outcome. And that does affect the way that we actually, do our model. And they said, they talked about it, they realized it's an inflammatory process. And of course so that's how our hypothesis is going to be about all short-term modeling of erectile dysfunction. So that's turning biology into math. And then this is where your point came in, clinically meaningful. You've got to turn the numbers, the math, back into biomedicine. What are the implications, right? One of the things that I often show is I actually show the students papers in which the results and the conclusions of papers in JAMA are the same, right? Like the results show there was a link between obesity and death, and the conclusion, there is a link between obesity and death, right? And you're like, well, that's not converting those numbers. The conclusion of that study should be, if we believe this to be causal, it's like we should, public health efforts to reduce obesity, or if we're not sure it's causal, it should be a research implication. We should investigate the causal mechanisms linking obesity to death in this particular patient population. So that's a great point. The distinction between clinical and statistical significance is often seen as a kind of, very quick thing that we talk about in stats, but it's part of this much larger thing, which is what your job as a statistician is converting biomedicine to math and then the critical stage of converting math back into biomedicine. And you're telling, a lot of what I do in my teaching is showing patients, okay, what does this number mean? What are we going to conclude? When we have some others, I might circle back to that because it's such a key point, but when we have some others chime in, anyone else want to say what they...
I'm going to chime in because I had something very similar, and in my capacity, I'm helping child psychiatry residents interpret medical literature. So I provide like that translation service.
Oops, we lost you.
One of the points I had was, what is the effect size?
Right.
You know, people are generally taught to look at a p-value, you know,
Right.
whether or not something is significant, but they always have to, in the back of their mind, be asking themselves how much, you know, what is the
Right.
effect size, and is it clinically meaningful, or can they even define what clinically meaningful is in their research question, if they have one?
Well, look, just because I normally wait for somebody else to jump in here, and I will go back to someone, but the words that I would write down is concepts, not procedures. What are you trying to get your students to know? Concepts, not procedures, right? The typical stats teaching, like, here's how you do a t-test, here's how you do a regression, here's why regression is a generalization of a t-test, or, you know, whatever it is, right? And what I want people to understand is the concepts. And one of the concepts I just, said to Maya was, what do we, biostatistics is the process of turning biology into math, blah, 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 right? Now, you're saying, well, you've got to look at the effect size and not just the p-value. And what's the bigger concept there? The bigger concept there is what we do as statisticians. I actually show a little slide sometimes, which is, it's a machine, and it says statistician, and in goes data and outcomes p-values. The idea that a statistician is a machine for converting data into p-values. But I say what we actually do, what is stats? We do two very different types of things: inference and estimation. And what I often say is, most of my work, the inference is completely uninteresting, right? Is PSA associated with prostate cancer outcomes? Yeah, we know it is. It's been demonstrated for years, and it's obvious. It's like impossible that it couldn't be. It's like how much and in what way, and what's the, it's all about estimation. What I almost everything I do is an estimation. But anyway, so what you can say is effect size versus p-values, that you can plan out and then talk about inference and estimation as the two things statisticians do, and how inference is, I talk about, is like the first hoop to jump through. So I talk about, no one says, how tall is Bigfoot? How much does the Loch Ness Monster weigh, right? You say, is there a Loch Ness Monster? And is there Bigfoot? And like, okay, now we know there's a Bigfoot. How tall is Bigfoot, right? Or how much does the Loch Ness Monster weigh, right? You don't ask the first question until, so, okay, great. We do inference and estimation. Don't forget the estimation, right? Because the p-value is just inference. It's just the first step. So that's how you can sort of blow that up again and make sure that you're teaching these bigger concepts rather than like the smaller little parts. I'll say that in a different way. You're using these very specific things like, oh, it's not just the p-value, it's the effect size in the child psychiatry work to demonstrate this bigger concept that statistics is about inference and estimation. If someone else want to chime in what you think you want the students to go home with? And you can't say I want them to go home with concepts, not procedures, because that's just stealing my. Anyone else got some thoughts?
For context, what I'm teaching is I get 2 hours with them a year. So it's not much, it's just so I want them to just be familiar with the vocabulary so that they can be resourceful over time. So it's just, it comes back to the concepts, but just they need to be introduced to something so that when they go look it up on YouTube, they know what to actually look up to sort of drive them in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've got a thankless task, haven't you? Yeah. You should ask them. You say, "Look, we're bored in the second hour. I think we should just cut it down to like 45 minutes. That's plenty."
That'd be great.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I think when you talk about vocab, it's the same thing as one of the prior Akil. That's right? That was your name. There you go, Akil. My best friend at high school married a guy called Akil, so Akil's a very good in that. Is what to be clear about, there's tons of vocab in stats, right? I mean, it's often I'm on a Zoom call and my partner comes in and she, after the, she's like, I didn't understand a single word, like even a single word of what you said for an hour, right? Because it's all vocab. So we have to think about what vocab is important. And again, I'd get maybe think about reorienting around concepts.
Mhm.
Right?
I didn't want to say concepts because you said concepts already.
Yeah, right.
I was gonna ask you how you dwindled that list down to like the most important one.
What are the most important concepts?
Well, or definitions that he was trying to teach in like less than 2 hours.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't get into definitions. I mean, what's the definition of right? What's the definition of rigorous? I mean, like most of these I find definitions sort of really pretty unhelpful. And I would say some words are just a way, like, my doctorate was in clinical epidemiology, and David Sackett, who was the father of clinical epidemiology, refused to define it, right? He said, you use the word and then, let's think about the underlying concepts here, what's involved in clinical epidemiology. So yeah, I think what we, when you say, Akil said we want to understand stats, and you're saying, well, we want them to get the vocab, that's great. I think we want to think a little bit more on, well, out of that, which parts of the vocab are important, and which parts of the understanding which bit of the stats do you really have to understand. Does anyone else want to sort of chime in with what they think they want the students to go away with?
I have another question. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I'll say one thing just came to my mind. I'm not teaching. I just thought this would be interesting and wanted to attend.
Okay.
Was thinking about like how to interpret figures or tables. So like I guess how to evaluate or understand presentations of data.
So somebody sees, I think this was Akil's point, it's like if someone's reading a paper and they see a table, what does that mean, right?
Yeah, I think I was in the 2 hours of statistics before my PhD, where, when I was a clinician, I pretty much skipped over like the methods and the results because it was intimidating to me and I didn't understand any of it. And
went straight
that
to figures and tables, you say.
Yeah. And so, in one of my first classes at WashU, we would go, talk about how to make people respond. We'd talk about papers from like a figure perspective, like each person would go around a room and you'd have to like talk about what the figure was saying and, how it was set up. And that was very intimidating, but it helped everyone to learn, why were they presenting the data this way? What do the axes mean?
Right. So the reason why they were presenting the data that way is it was one of the preset options on their statistical software. That's normally the answer. It's interesting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send Keith some PDFs which you can then circulate. So we've actually, in urology, the field of urology, there's 4 major journals, and we've come to an agreement on how statistics should be reported, presented, how figures and tables should be presented now, how to talk about causality in papers, right? Because I don't know if you've ever noticed this paper, they want it both ways. They'll say an association was found, and therefore we should, doctors should not do this, or patients should reduce. And you're like, wait a minute, that's a causal claim. Oh no, we were very clear that causation doesn't mean correlate, and they kind of tack back and forth. So, but I'll make sure those guidelines do go out, because that will, and as I say to folks, try and get the underlying principles rather than, it says don't report p-values, report p-values to one significant figure unless it's close to 0.05. And I don't want people to like slavishly like, oh, wait a minute, when p-value is 0.37, that means it's one. Try and understand why that you do that, right? And that's actually maybe a useful thing to share with your students is, how to present. And one of the things that I teach is how to present. As a lot of these investigators will either be doing their own stats or working with statisticians, and a lot of the statisticians are actually not very good at presenting their research, right? They're very good at solving a lemma, but they're not very good at actually providing nice looking tables or nice looking figures or writing a results section. I mean, my team, by the way, has to write most of the methods, because it's often stats, and all the methods and all the results section, including the tables, the figures, everything, as marked down directly from the R statistical package, and that gets handed to the investigator. And then so and that's all following certain sort of guidelines of how to do tables. So anyway, I'll make sure that you get those. Yeah, okay. We'll just do it, Emma. Some of you, you're doing this sort of some of you are doing this 2 or 3 hour course. The rest of you, can I ask, do you ever have students actually do a data analysis, actually sort of do a t-test, for example, on some data? Does anyone do that?
I tried one year to kind of do, after all the lecturing, tried to have them run some of it with some basic things, or watch me run it when I did it on my software. I would say that did not go well.
Yeah, and why didn't it go well?
My first year teaching a course, so perhaps less concepts and more definitions and information, how to use this and when kind of teaching, which largely didn't work. And then some of the residents actually the chief residents do help me design as the course goes through the year. So halfway through the course, they're like, oh, it'd probably be really helpful for us to see, not just in the papers, how the numbers come out, but like, if we have a statistician do the work for us and they give us the outputs, what does it look like? And do we kind of understand how to run them ourselves? If basic things, they weren't asking for like regressions necessarily, and so we did a 1 hour in didactics on that. And I mean, I think the feedback, my residents are very vocal. I think the feedback was like, they didn't remember the original rules and assumptions that I had taught, like, several lectures before about why to do. So they didn't know what they were doing. So therefore they couldn't really then interpret it, and they couldn't really understand it. So it was definitely watching me do it and seeing the values that came out was kind of like so what?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question about if you're going to do this, and I have my students do this, the question is, why do you have them do it, right? Why do you actually have them download a data set, run it through some software?
Yeah.
So there's two things. One is that in many statistics textbooks, like chapter 4 questions, here is a data set, what is the t-statistic, right? Or calculate the p-value for whatever it is, right? And I never get them to do that. The questions are, here is some data set from here's an example of what I do. Here's a data set from a single arm study on acupuncture for neck pain. The data are the range of motion before and after the course of acupuncture. Does acupuncture work for neck pain? And that's always a question, like, what would you conclude from, so there's a couple of reasons why I get people to actually do data. But partly it's like, if you're going to be a swimming coach, or if you're going to be around swimmers, it's useful to get in the water, right? To actually sort of think through it. I often put a lot of errors in the data sets, so that they learn to look at the data to see if there are errors in the data. That's one of the first things. I mean, as a statistician, it's it's kind of often it's more time spent cleaning the data and asking the investigator. Patient 7 is 187 years old. Could you please tell me their correct age? Right, that's a lot of it. So that's just not something that you get to see unless you're given an actual data sets to work on and to sort of think through. The other thing is, the reason I give the acupuncture example is this is what happens. It's like, does acupuncture work? And they were like, yeah, because the range of motion went up by 30 points, and the p-value is very small. And they're like, great. I'm like, okay, I'm going to pose the question another way. A single-arm, uncontrolled, non-randomized study of acupuncture was done, and the patients felt better after getting the acupuncture. Does acupuncture work? And I'm like, well, no. And I'm like, why not? And I'm like, because it's a non-randomized trial. You need a randomized and you need a control. I'm like, but you didn't just say that. And that's a whole, we can turn that into a lesson about the fact that the numbers don't give you the answer, right? You have to integrate the numbers with a whole bunch of other things, such as what does the rest of the literature say? What was the study design? And so on and so forth. So that's the reason why to actually to get students to do it. Sorry, go on.
How long, when you do that task, how long do you give for that type of
okay, well, the way
you
that
give
I
like an
do it,
hour or two, or is it they go home and do it and then they have to come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I do is, so the way I structure my course is they have some reading to do before each lecture, and then there's the lectures are every week, or the classes are every week, and then there's some data sets that they so after lecture 3 they download the data sets for lecture 3, and there's some questions, right? This is a data set of marathon runners, what predicts how fast you run the marathon, or whatever it is. And then I give an hour and a half. The class is an hour and a half, and the first 3/4 of an hour I go through the problems. I'm like, let's download the data set. Now let's first have a look. Now you can see there's actually some obvious data errors. So let's, delete those particular, whatever it is. And then, okay, now I'm going to, that one, the marathon running. So what predicts? So we're going to do a multivariable regression. So this is the regression. It's a linear regression. Look at, this is what comes up on the software. What does that number mean? Right. And then they'll say, oh, women run 26 minutes slower than, all right, great. Well, then what does this number mean for training miles? Because it's not like, do you have training miles or not? It's how many training miles. And then you get them to think like, oh, yeah, it's your time decreases by 1 minute for every additional, training mile you run while preparing for the marathon. So I go through that. And just so you know, the second half is open office hours. So I'm like, ask me a question from the homework, from the assignments, from a paper you read, from something you're working on in your lab or your clinical trial, and whatever it is, don't worry about the fact that this is some super niche thing about, genetic dysregulation in this rare cancer. I will be able to pull out of that some statistical principles that everyone can learn from, because that's what I can do for you as a teacher. Rather than just lecture at you, we can have a discussion and can illustrate general concepts. And I can show everybody that almost all of the things that we encounter that are problems illustrate a very limited number of statistical problems, such as, is this inference? Is this an inference problem? Is it an estimation problem? Is it an issue? What do we mean by power? So what do we conclude from a negative, from a quote unquote negative? If the p-value is high, what do we conclude from that? And so on and so forth. So that's how I happen to run my lectures, and that's why I have students do the assignments to actually get some experience in this sort of data analysis, for the purposes of, as I said, learning things like the fact that there are problems in the data, and the problems in the data. Yeah, I mean, errors in the data, and the software printout will come out and they have to interpret it and understand what it means. And then this whole part of the job is to convert the math back into the biomedicine. What do you conclude about the effectiveness of this, that, or the other? Or, what would you conclude about what helps people run marathons quicker, or whatever it is? So some things on the chat. So I just wanted to make sure I just have to jump off. Okay, so nothing substantive on that. So I mean, let's see what other sort of questions I have here. One of the things that, so you're generally teaching about clinicians, right? You're generally teaching clinicians. So what do you think the number one skill that clinicians need if they want a career in which they're doing research with respect to statistics? And I'll give you a clue. It's nothing to do with understanding statistics or inference or how to read a paper. What's the skill they want as a researcher, do you think?
I was gonna say if they can infer things properly for clinical decision making, so that sounds like that's not where you're going.
Right. Well, I think that's more, yeah, I mean, look, that's just to be clear, that's great for somebody who's, every clinician really should be reading literature and knowing what to do about
Well,
it.
yeah, that's kind of what we bump, yeah.
But I was talking specifically about people who wanted to be researchers, right? So what if you're going to be a researcher and you want a research, a career in which you're doing clinical research in which numbers are coming out? What's the one? What do you think the number one skill that somebody needs to know is?
How to construct a question? Oh, go, Libby.
I was
Go
saying
for it.
Jinx.
You say it.
Yeah, how to design a question, how to take their idea and to construct it into whatever type of statistical concept that you actually want out of it. So how to design a study, basically.
Yeah.
How to ask a question.
Yeah, I was gonna say how to ask a question as well.
Well, I mean, how do you tell a clinician how to ask a clinical question?
I mean, I think like when I hear you speak, like I also think about like, how do you take that general idea and continue to like ask them questions to like funnel it down into something that's actually a study, right? Like, how do you take that global idea of like, does X exist in all the different possibilities of the way that you can look at it and choose the one that's actually inside their brain? Like, I think actually like reaching in and starting to operationalize what it is that they're actually thinking and how they're thinking about it.
Right, so that's the process of turning a biomedical question into a math question, right? But I don't think that's the clinician's job. I think that's the statistician's job.
Mm.
Right?
Maybe ability to communicate what he wanted to do.
I'm sorry?
Ability to communicate, at least this is what.
You're basically there. I think one of the main skills you have to do is teach them how to work with statisticians, right? And so one of the things that I say, and I talk about this, I says, you talk to any clinical researcher at the end of their career, did the big clinical trial or found out this new association or whatever, they will all tell you, they'll say, what made it work for you? How come you were so successful? And it's like, well, a great team, but they will always mention the statistician, right? We had a great team at SWOG doing the stats, whatever it is, right? So it's actually teaching them how to work with a statistician. What I talk to them about is the fact that there's 3 different ways you can work with a statistician. There's 4 different ways you can work with a statistician, right? There's do-it-yourself statistics, in other words, not working with a statistician. There is a consulting, there's collaboration, there's a partnership. I do go on to say that there's a dating analogy there where, consulting is like a one-night stand, collaboration is going steady, and partnership is like marriage. And then I can say, by the way, do not use do-it-yourself statistics in that analogy, which allows me to have like this sort of shocked silence for a bit, and then everyone getting the fact that I'd made a masturbation joke in front of 150 people. But it's, we talk about that, and it is actually a very good analogy, is that, it meets the superficial needs, but doesn't actually get you very far, the one night stand, the consulting. So, that's the sort of things that I talk about. And also I'm brutally honest with them, which is, let's face facts, most statisticians don't give a crap about your clinical research, right? If you gave them a copy of biometrics or a copy of the New England Journal of Medicine, it's not that they would pick the biometrics up. They would say, what are you even putting this on my desk for? Why should that even interest me, right? And the reason a lot of that is about is the career incentives in statistics, which are about, no one gets famous by being the second author of a paper that changes medicine, right? But you write some first author paper in Biometrica in which you are the, some super esoteric method that no one ever uses, but it has some, nice, proves some nice lemmas in it or whatever. And you get to go around the world and you get promoted and all that kind of stuff. And you have to tell doctors and clinicians that this is a problem, right? That, it's hard to find statisticians. Statisticians often don't care, that their whole career incentive is around methodologic research, technical math research, not about helping you. And it will often be the case is like, how quickly can I make this guy go away so that I can get back to writing my theory paper or writing my grant on methods, because that is what's going to forward my career. So you do actually have to bring these things up with clinicians. And then the other thing is that I think you have to, is as a clinician, you have to be in control of what you want from the statistician. And what an acceptable thing from a statistician is not raw printout from R or SAS with a couple of things, here's the p-value, with like circles around, is the statistician is the person in charge of numbers and data. And so their job is to make sure that all the data that is presented, whether in figures or in numbers, is correct. So what they do, it's their job to provide you with markdown, with stuff straight out of the stat software that has the figures and the tables, and it's that's their job. Right? And we often, and I show them what we do in our group as part of that. And it's also, I talk with clinicians about how this issue of reproducible statistics, which is, amazingly, I would have thought that's like, when you go to graduate school as a statistician, that would be the first thing you're taught. And it's not taught at all, right? We get people out here and like, okay, we're going to have to teach you how to program. Okay, this is what a loop is, right? Here's how you code. Here's how you save stuff on GitHub. Here's how you name your files. Here's how you manage data, all that kind of stuff. The basic work the basic skills you need to be a collaborating statistician and to run reproducible analysis is often just not taught at all on PhD courses. And someone is called a brilliant statistician because they solved some difficult lemma, right? And and wrote some paper that's full of numbers, and never the word patient or suffering or pain did not appear at any point in their PhD. So I really think that's an important discussion that you need to have with your clinicians. I just want to, in the last couple of minutes, want to get back into Akil talked about understanding the stats in a paper, and I think David talked about the vocab. I would go back and think, like, what is it you really want? What are the key concepts you want people to understand? And then relate the understanding of the paper or the vocab to that. So as I was saying, I don't think somebody needs to understand that it was a general additive model with nonlinear terms and the time to event. But what they do need to understand is that what comes out of that is a hazard ratio, that a hazard is not a relative risk, right? Getting back to vocab, right? Because you often see patients who received the drug had half the risk of death. And like, that's actually not what a hazard is. It's called a hazard ratio, not a risk ratio. It's kind of easy. If it's an odds ratio, it's half the odds, not half the risk, right? But also that's the estimate, and then the p-value is about the inference. So right, which they've got to understand the paper, but some of the methods they don't need to know, but they certainly need to know how to interpret the results. And one of the key things is, what do you do if the p-value is high? Well, then you're going to focus on the confidence interval, right? And what if the p-value is low? Then you're probably going to focus on the estimate, right? So that's the kind of thing that it's when we say, well, we need to understand a paper, let's focus in on what they need to understand and what are some of the sort of key concepts. And I would say, things like the fact that it's got to be converted back into the mathematical results have got to be converted back into implications for research and or implications for practice, and that process includes understanding the study design, the limitations, and what the other data say. I would say inference 101, right? And the idea that it's not hard if the p-value, and we just call it 5% for easy, if the p-value is less than 5%, it's significant. And we reject the null hypothesis. And if the p-value is 5% or more, it's not statistically significant, and we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And what does that mean? It means that we don't accept the null hypothesis, and it means that we don't say approaching significance or a trends to significance, right? It's very easy, something either is or is not, right? So that's kind of inference 101. So, that's the sort of thing that, I want them to understand the papers, but like write down what's the key concepts that they need to get. I think, for example, asymptotic versus exact statistics is not a concept that a clinician needs to understand when reading a paper, but what to do with a high p-value, or the difference between inference and estimation. And I think you can apply that same sort of idea to the vocabulary, right? Because you're going to see vocabulary like, regression or asymptotic or whatever, exact, whatever it is. And I don't think actually they need to understand that at all. But they need to understand the concept, if you're going to get into the vocab around the null hypothesis or around the p-value. Can I just ask in terms of time, is it an hour, or is it, because we're at the top of the hour, is it a little bit more? I'll leave you.
Yeah, we may go a couple minutes past the hour, but it was up to the top of the hour. So
yeah, so I just wanted to leave it to you now. Do you have any sort of last questions for me? Any last ones?
How do I take your course?
How do you take the course that I do?
Yeah, that you do. Yeah.
Well, like, you know what? If you want, like, you can't attend the lectures. That's a little hard. If you're interested, I could send you the, because it's all online, right? So the what you have to read and the lectures you have to do, and I could send you to the website because that's accessible outside.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. I mean, just even one, I would learn a ton, but also just seeing how you conduct it in general. I think learning by example is a great resource.
The course website. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really going to be. It's a bit like reading the transcript of a film. Is what you're going to be getting. You've got really kind of no idea what the film is, because it's my discussions with the students and how I show them, let's go through this, and that's going to be missing. But one thing that you'll pick up hopefully is, both from the guidelines and if you read the book, is it's the real focus on errors, right? About a third, 40% of the book is the sort of assignment part, and it's really like just avoiding error. I mean, my dad was a fabulous teacher in this regard, because he was an absolutely horrendous father, and all I did was just whatever he did, I did the opposite. I have an amazing time raising my kids, and so it's the same sort of thing. It's like a lot of focus on what people are doing wrong, and if you just avoid that. And I mean, I think if I was going to lead you with a final thought, because I think we have to wrap up now, right, Keith? Which is that the main thing you have to communicate as a teacher is that you care, and that this is important. And in order for you to care, to communicate that, you have to feel it. You have to feel that it's important. And what's my rationale for saying that this is it's important for me to be there, and why I've been doing so? The guy before me did the course at MSK for 3 years. The guy before him did it for 5, and I've been doing it for over 20, right? And they was like, oh, this is interfering with my research. And I've just been doing it for over 20 years now, because I care. And the reason that I care is because I passionately believe that we can analyze data in good ways and bad ways. And if we do it in the right way, that's going to help alleviate human suffering. And there's plenty of suffering to go around, right? There's, 600,000, 1.9 million Americans are diagnosed with cancer. 600,000 of them die from it. Most deaths it's pretty horrid. It's a horrid death to die from cancer, especially as it's coming down the pipe, right? And that's not even getting into rheumatoid arthritis or ulcerative colitis or whatever it is. There's a lot of suffering to go around, and through medical research, we've alleviated a lot of that suffering, right? These are numbers you have to know. Do you know 150 years ago what proportion of children would die before their 10th birthday? It was 1 in 3. At the turn of the century, it was 1 in 10. It's now 1 in 100. Why is that? right? Because epidemiologists and people who analyze data worked out what was killing people and how to prevent that, right? So you have to really understand, you have to really care about your profession and understand how it has really makes an impact on people's lives. Like going back to a father, is how, you know, I was not, I was not worried my kids were going to die before 10 years old, because, that's a rare thing right now, right? Because, before you'd expect children to be dying. And the second part of that is, you probably know the data that most of the stats in most of the medical literature is wrong, right? There's routinely this, the paper I cite from my own field of urology is they had statisticians look at 100 papers or whatever, and 70% of them had errors in them, right? Clinicians are routinely doing data and they're doing it wrong, and they're routinely interpreting data and getting that wrong, and it's harming people. And you have to internalize that and feel that and communicate that passion and communicate the importance of what you do to our students. Otherwise, for a clinician who has to do the pediatrics rotation, they've got to do the internal medicine rotation, they've got to do the geriatrics one, which everyone knows is a pain because you've got to do that freaking nursing home over, and they've also got to do the statistics rotation, and you're just a tick off of the box unless you're able to internalize that passion and communicate that to your students. So I guess I'll leave you with that. But if you have any questions for me directly, just I'll send some stuff to you, Keith. If you want to ask me any questions, Keith can share my email address.
That would be great. Yeah. And thanks, Andrew. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It reminded me, this might be a apocryphal story about John Tukey, but I've heard that apparently at some lecture at Princeton, John Tukey came in and just started like eating an orange and waiting for people to ask questions. By the time he finished his orange, no one had asked a question, and so John Tukey just left. So I'm glad that we took advantage of this opportunity to ask a lot of questions. And I think it was very enlightening. Thank you for sharing your experience with us, and I absolutely agree. I think the jumping off point for all of this has to be kind of that remembering that there's human beings associated with all these numbers, right? And that when it can become kind of this bloodless thing in the minds of people from the outside. And so really reminding people that, like, yes, this can be boring and we have to learn some stuff. We have to struggle with some stuff, but it all happens for a very good reason and a very successful reason in the scientific enterprise of biomedical research. So thank you again. I'll share those materials. I'll pass along your contact information, and thanks everybody for coming.
The last chapter of my book, by the way, do you remember? And if you remember what it's called?
I don't offhand, but
okay. It's called that statistics is about people, even if you can't see the tears.
Yes.
And I chose that very specifically to be the last chapter because that's what I want people to go away with. But anyway, it's been great talk, very enjoyable.
Thank you very much.
This is great. Thank you.